What's up, guys? So, if you spend any time reading the comments section of a song or music video, you always see some variation of this. Today's music is so unoriginal, there hasn't been a new genre in 30 years. It's not untrue to point out that the music of older decades is more clearly defined, and as we reach the 2000s and 2010s, it becomes a bit murkier. But that's not because of a lack of new genres. It's because of a lack of consensus around which genres are genuine and which ones are merely meme genres. It takes a few years for the dust to settle, and that's why we're hopping into this topic now, 4 solid years later. What are the styles of music that will go down in the history books as the new genres of the 2010s? To keep things organized, we're going to use a loose iceberg model, where the more mainstream genres are at the top, and the darker, weirder, more underground ones are further down. Now, 3 quick things to address first. I want to emphasize that this video is about new genres, not just music that was popular during the 2010s. So we aren't going to talk about K-pop or dubstep, since these were developed much earlier. Secondly, determining exactly when a genre started can be tricky. According to Rate Your Music, the first punk albums date back to the late 1950s. But nobody would consider this the era of punk rock. So rather than merely looking at when the first possible release came out, we'll be looking at when this genre became more of a full-fledged movement. And lastly, I just want to point out there were probably hundreds of genres that could have been on this list, especially when you consider all the Tumblr micro-genres, offshoots of Vaporwave, and so on. Rather than attempt to name every single one of these, I'm going to focus on the 15 or so that I think had the biggest influence, or that I personally found the most interesting. I know inevitably there will be some community that feels slighted, not getting mentioned, so please forgive me, leave a comment, others will upvote it, you'll feel vindicated. So as I was saying, we'll begin at the top of the iceberg. I'm not going to dwell too much on these because, well, I know you guys, you want to hear about the weird ones. So the further down we get, the longer we'll dissect each one. Okay, now let's begin. Number 1, alternative R&B. In 2011, a music writer jokingly referred to the music of Frank Ocean, The Weeknd, and How to Dress Well as PBR&B, essentially calling it the hipster take on R&B music. To his surprise, the term took off. It seemed to more appropriately describe the wave of R&B singers who used rich, atmospheric production derived from chillwave or cloud rap.
Southern California, much like Arizona, my eyes don't shed tears, but boy, they pour.
And those whose fashion and visual aesthetics tended to be more eclectic than traditional R&B. Over time, the more serious term, alternative R&B, took its place. Now, pigeonholing these artists as exclusively R&B is a bit inaccurate, since much of what they're doing could be described as avant-garde pop or electronic. But nevertheless, many of these artists were quite successful throughout the decade, making this one of the more commonly heard new genres of the 2010s. Number 2, drill. So we should probably establish how trap beats completely dominated hip-hop and dance music throughout the decade. If the boom-bap rhythm of the 90s and early 2000s could be described as slow, funky, and organic sounding, then trap beats were the exact opposite, ultra-sharp and machine-like. It was first developed decades ago, so we aren't going to consider it a new genre of the 2010s. However, drill is one variant that is. Drill originated from a group of artists on the south side of Chicago. The music is dark and dramatic, but the vocals are uncharacteristically deadpan. Often, but not always, they follow a robotic cadence. Words are practically crammed together to make each stanza identical in flow. A snitch, nigga. Part of the cult following around drill music has been its authenticity in portraying the gang violence of Chicago. In fact, there's a whole genre of videos that analyze its lyrics and the real-life shootings that took place. Sadly, many of drill's earliest pioneers have been murdered, or themselves convicted of murder. While the genre never saw success on the mainstream charts, I can safely say that, as somebody living in Chicago during the 2010s, it was very much the backdrop of the city, blasting from cars as soon as you laid your head down to sleep. Not to mention, Chicago drill has inspired variants from Brooklyn and the UK, which have become much more mainstream. So for this reason, I'm placing drill near the top of the iceberg. Number 3, Afrobeats. In May 2012, a new dance song broke the top 10 on the UK singles chart. On the surface, it was very simple, a bass that alternated between 2 notes. But behind the scenes, there was an intricate rhythm that made this song infectious.
I have a confession. Don't take it personal. I have a confession.
Oliver Twist was an example of Afrobeats, a new genre emerging from Nigeria and Ghana that would soon be making waves internationally. And let's get one thing straight. Afrobeats is distinct from Afrobeat, the genre pioneered by Fela Kuti in the 1970s. Afrobeats with an S has been floating around since the late 2000s, and appears to have first been used in print by DJ Abranti in 2011, when he launched his Afrobeats radio show on London's Choice FM. At that time, DJ Abranti, who was born in England to Ghanaian parents, had been hosting parties for the West African diaspora in London. His repertoire included Nigerian pop and R&B, as well as hip life from Ghana, the combination of high life and hip hop.
Yeah, but I got the facts to back the superstition. Beast to Mr. Kofi and whatever the mission.
Thus, Afrobeats was coined as something of a marketing term, to put a wide range of sounds under one roof.
So African music has always been there, Afrobeats has always been there. All I did was repackage it and present it to the commercial market.
This forces the question, is Afrobeats actually a new genre of the 2010s, or has it been around for a long time? According to Ayu Shonaya, filmmaker and Afrobeats historian, a pivotal moment for the genre came in 1999, when the Nigerian rap group Rough, Rugged and Raw released Waiting Day. The song not only featured a sample of Fela Kuti, but also the 5-beat pattern common in West African traditional music.
But really, that is the backbone of Afrobeats.
But while the seed was planted, it didn't really blossom until the 2010s. It was at this point you saw the viral growth of releases, as well as stylistic tendencies that set this genre apart from pop music elsewhere in the world. For instance, the rhythm is typically created using hand percussion, or digital versions of these instruments, giving the songs a much smoother and bouncier feel. In the background, there are soft synth pads doused in reverb. When combined with Afrobeats' ultra-clear vocals, the resulting sound is very futuristic. I almost want to say watery, because it makes me think of these Frutiger screensavers. Anyone else? Maybe it's just me. We can also point out the vocals, which often use Nigerian languages or pidgin English, as well as the frequent use of call and response choruses. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, Afrobeats started creeping onto the Billboard charts, thanks to artists like Wizkid, Rema, Burna Boy, and Davido. Thus, I'm placing Afrobeats fairly close to the top. Even if you never consciously looked it up, you probably heard Afrobeats at some point. Number 4, Neoperreo. There's no doubt that reggaeton was one of the most popular genres globally of the 2010s. As a quick refresher, reggaeton is a Latin American evolution of dancehall and hip-hop that is based around the dembow rhythm. While the genre traces its roots back to the late 80s and early 90s, the 2010s brought about a particularly pop-friendly version that saw artists like Daddy Yankee, Bad Bunny, and J Balvin all score #1 Billboard hits, not to mention the theme music to the 2020 SpongeBob movie. But that's not what we're talking about now. The past decade also gave birth to reggaeton's younger, weirder, gothier sister, a genre that's become known as Neoperreo. Similar to the way that indie or alternative rock were a reaction against the growing rigidity of mainstream rock, Neoperreo was a movement of DIY producers, party organizers, and music fans who wanted to sing, dance, and dress in ways that weren't acceptable in mainstream reggaeton clubs. While the movement began organically across different cities, one of its first big proponents was Tomasa del Real, a tattoo artist from northern Chile, who was disappointed that there was no club where all her friends could dance. "All of my friends are strange," she told the website Latino Life. "By that I mean one is a metalhead, another is gay. I dress strange. One is rich, one is poor." So instead, she started hosting parties herself that embraced a more inclusive, DIY ethos.
So this is the new wave of people making the new music for clubs because we cannot listen to Gasolina forever.
Perreo means twerk, she said, and Neoperreo means the new wave of twerk, because the Perreo twerk is just for girls with big asses, but Neo twerk is for everybody. When you listen to playlists of Neoperreo, the songs are notably darker than mainstream reggaeton. The imagery and music can be disturbing. At times, uncomfortably so. Also, in contrast to mainstream reggaeton, the genre is dominated by women, often with sex-positive messaging, and it's become popular among LGBT audiences. This has caused a lot of publications to focus on Neoperreo as a political movement, a stance which Tomasa del Real has pushed back on. Just because women are involved doesn't make something feminist or political, she said in a Boiler Room interview. "We aren't at all interested in people's genders. We just want everyone to feel welcome." While Neoperreo has some mainstream appeal, I think it's safe to say that this is also a pretty experimental genre. So this will be our first foray into the depths of the iceberg. Hey guys, I just wanted to interject and say, you've probably noticed how we've been playing these songs in really short segments. That's unfortunately what YouTube requires us to do for copyright reasons. It's also possible a few tracks might get muted, God forbid, but we always post uncensored versions of these videos to Patreon, so feel free to check that out. Okay, and on to the next section. Number 5, Chillwave. Alright, so I know including Chillwave in this video will be a bit controversial, since it both started and became popular before the 2010s. However, Chillwave was extremely influential to many of the genres on this list, so we're going to take a brief moment to discuss it anyway. To explain Chillwave, I think it helps to take a quick refresher on the music of the 2000s. When it comes to pop music, some of the overarching themes were the use of crisp digital production, ultra-clear and expressive vocals, and even when the music wasn't super original, a tendency to be fashion-forward, as opposed to imitating the styles of older decades.
I'm sold 3008, you sold 2000 and late.
But then, at the very end of the aughts, something changed. Well, at least within the niche of pitchfork-reading hipsters, the aesthetics of pop music changed dramatically. Instead of sounding crisp and clear, songs were hazy and lo-fi. Vocals were absolutely caked in reverb. And artists were intentionally trying to disguise themselves as an artifact from an earlier decade, such as, in the case of Washed Out, by sampling a little-known Italo disco track from the early 80s. So what accounted for this shift? For decades, there had always been a niche of bands who preferred to sound lo-fi. But the genre that would soon be named Chillwave, based on a joke published by a parody hipster blog, was part of a broader cultural movement. That is, the obsession with nostalgia and the appropriation of trends from prior decades. In many ways, this defined the zeitgeist of the emerging hipster subculture.
Hey, Blake.
For better or worse. But in terms of music, it was deeper than just a fashion trend. Throughout the 2000s, there were a number of underground artists who started to play with the concept of memory. For Boards of Canada, it was taking the sounds of old science films they remembered as children in the 70s and 80s. For James Ferraro, it was, quote, the headspace of the moment just before you go to sleep as a child, while somewhere in the distance, the sounds of pop and disco come muffled through the wall. In both cases, it has the potential to create a deeply emotional, even frightening experience, as your brain suddenly connects synapses that hadn't been fired up in decades. The trend goes by various names, including hypnagogic pop and hauntology. But for our purposes, it started to penetrate pop music at the end of the 2000s. Ariel Pink, Neon Indian, Toro y Moi, and of course, Washed Out, all started to push this psychological exercise onto the masses. Synthesizers that had been in the bargain bin since the 80s were back in vogue. And suddenly, the sounds of decaying analog media, like tape hiss and saturation, were an intentional feature of the mix. As you're going to see, Chillwave and hypnagogic pop have had a huge influence on basically the whole rest of this video. And as for where Chillwave belongs on the iceberg, I'm gonna put it somewhat deep, but still fairly close to the surface. Number 6, Cloud Rap. Okay, so now we're back in the 2010s proper. Well, just about. On December 22nd, 2009, rapper Lil B, aka Based God, released his second mixtape. Lil B already had something of a cult following after releasing hundreds of tracks on his MySpace page.
Down in Ohio, swag like Ohio, down in Ohio.
But his new record would sound different.
King of rap, I could bet my money on that. Can't face the facts that a young guy killing shit.
The record, called Six Kiss, was full of hazy, dreamy, instrumental samples. It sounded more like Sigur Rós than the aggressive digital beats most hip-hop songs were using at the time. This genre would soon be called cloud rap, and it serves as the basis for the coming revolution of SoundCloud rappers later in the decade. But let's back up a second. A lot of people will point out that elements of cloud rap were emerging throughout the 2000s, inspired by similar impulses as those creating hypnagogic pop, taking weird, hazy samples reminiscent of a dystopian future. But these were pretty isolated releases from artists who probably weren't aware of each other. The cloud rap movement officially kicked off in 2010 when the blog Space Age Hustle used the term to describe the music of Lil B, as well as rap duo Main Attractions, who used some really wild production. The term cloud rap came from a conversation where Lil B pointed to a CGI image of a castle in the clouds and stated, "That's the kind of music I want to make." In particular, Lil B's track, I'm God, quickly became something of a gold standard for the genre.
My new name is Space God, ice cream paint job, only come out in the dim light.
The backing track was created by Clams Casino, and in 2011, he told Red Bull Music Academy how this hazy, mysterious sound was created.
Like for the past few years, I've been only doing like vocal samples. I don't know why, and then like I started looking at him like, I really just like, I like the voice, and I've used that song for like so many other things.
The song he's referring to is Imogen Heap's Just For Now, originally released in 2005. What drew Clams Casino to the song was the challenge of creating a hip-hop beat out of something so unexpected. Like how in his earlier years, he would search completely random words on file-sharing websites just to find a weird variety of songs to sample. But it wasn't just the uniqueness of the track that made I'm God so compelling. It was also how Clams Casino chopped and pasted her vocals into these indecipherable fragments. He exploited the same mental space as chillwave and hypnagogic pop, the gap between dreaming and wakefulness. Instrumental track has become a part of internet folklore after a fan-made video was uploaded to YouTube, and thousands of commenters use it to post tributes to friends and family who have passed away. And of course, this is not to mention the contributions of Lil B, who made this track popular in the first place. Lil B is an enigma who cannot really be adequately summed up in a 5-minute segment. But I think we can look at this track as something of a microcosm of his output. There's the ethereal stream of conscious lyrics like,
somebody tell the ocean I'm the best out. Somebody tell the trees I'm here now.
And then there's,
I guess I'm a show off. Take my raincoat off. I'm so wet that a pussy get mad at me.
He existed to defy expectations, especially when it came to hip-hop conventions. He wore skinny jeans instead of baggy shorts. He named an album I'm Gay when the industry was still pretty homophobic. He rapped in a slow, nasally, monotone voice, at times about something haunting or beautiful.
Midnight comes, you tossing and turning. Look what you created, someone looking back at you. For the first time, this is not a club scene.
But most of the time about Unfortunately, Lil B's irreverence often got him labeled a meme rapper. But meanwhile, other rappers were taking the sounds of cloud rap and using them in more conventional ways. Specifically, A$AP Rocky, who also employed Clams Casino to produce several tracks off his debut mixtape. Other tracks were produced by Space Ghost Perp, another enigmatic figure who produced a lot of underground hip-hop. At times, he too dabbled in cloud rap.
I'm in my zone, putting on my cologne, Victoria's Secret on a matcha bro.
Both A$AP Rocky and Space Ghost Perp borrowed a lot from Southern hip-hop, another key influence to cloud rap. Soon you had Young Lean exploring this sound all the way from Sweden.
Drinking 40 salt and Honolulu with my shorty and she sipping on dripping poo-poo.
Or one of my personal favorites, Cities of Eve. By the mid-2010s, cloud rap would begin to inspire other subgenres of hip-hop that took its DIY ethos and unconventional sampling into new territory. The coming wave of SoundCloud Rap is when things would really blow up, something we'll return to in a bit. As for where to place Cloud Rap, in the honor of Lil B, I think we'll go deep. Number 7, Vaporwave. It's late 2010, and a strange album is making the rounds on music message boards. The album, which looks more like an old Sega box than an LP, contains weird slowed-down looped versions of 80s pop songs. It's clever, amusing, and also a bit frightening. And meanwhile, another album starts making the rounds with an equally strange cover. This one consists entirely of cheap MIDI-sounding music, like the music you hear on hold with your cable company. Except it could be quite unpredictable and chaotic. Together, these two records would become the founding documents of a genre known as Vaporwave. Vaporwave may not always be the most serious musical genre, but the impact it's had on the music and visual aesthetics of the 2010s was pretty profound. So let's go back to those two records. They were created by these two men, Daniel Lopatin, aka 10 Tricks Point Never, and James Ferraro. Both were electronic musicians who dabbled in the aforementioned genre of hypnagogic pop, but in these instances, they were basically just goofing around on the side. For Lopatin, it was about taking pop songs that have become so overplayed at shopping malls or waiting rooms. They've become a sort of mass cultural background music.
So I'm like always searching for like the juiciest moment in a pop track to sample and then sort of strip away, pull away, deconstruct, and kind of swathe in echo and get into this hypnotic state with it.
For Ferraro, the initial idea was to release an album entirely of ringtones, highly compressed digital MIDI sounds that had also become a sort of cultural background music. Both of these albums may very well have disappeared back into the internet void they came from, but for some reason, they struck a chord. For one, it was actually quite cathartic to hear corporate music turned into something more absurd and personal. Hearing Toto's Africa slowed down and chopped up kind of felt like an act of rebellion. But more than that, it turns out that these records tapped into a feeling of nostalgia that a lot of people didn't even realize they had. Not nostalgia for an earlier time in their life, or even a period of history, but nostalgia for a lost future. One which technology or media had promised you, but never materialized. Take Ramona Xavier's 2011 album Floral Shop, released under the pseudonym Macintosh Plus. She followed the Echo Jam's model of sampling slowed down bits of music. The track Lisa Frank 420 is made up entirely of the Diana Ross song It's Your Move. But slowed down just enough to sound like it's from a different universe. For me personally, it's an uncomfortable feeling. You have these elements of smooth jazz that are supposed to evoke a sense of leisure, but one from a distant past, one that now feels warped and twisted. The same goes for Floral Shop's album art, which looks like a slide from an 80s sales pitch, evoking high art and progress, but now, in retrospect, appears cold and humanless. This feeling can be explained by hauntology, a concept first conceived by philosopher Jacques Derrida, and then applied to music by Mark Fisher and Simon Reynolds. These writers argued that Because we live in a world where consumerism has quashed our ability to think about a radically different future, we are continuously haunted by the past and the lost futures that could have been. Therefore, it is with a sense of nostalgia we experience Floral Shop's rendering of 1980s corporate leisure, while also feeling a sense of dread at this dream's inability to materialize. And if my explanation here is getting a bit too heady, then let's just take a look at Vaporwave art. A lot of drawings evoke a sense of awe and wonder of an early digital age. Palm trees, sunsets, and cityscapes. But at the same time, there are often elements of fear and loneliness, a simultaneous embrace of the 80s and 90s corporate dream, while also an acknowledgement of its spiritual emptiness. After Floral Shop would come an explosion of Vaporwave albums, and each artist would have their own take on this equation. E-Spirit mined samples that evoked the dreamlike promise of digital technology. While Blank Banshee created a darker landscape with trap beats. Yunbei leaned heavily into the leisure side of things by sampling Japanese city pop. More on this later. And then you had Saint Pepsi revitalizing McDonald's moon-faced entertainer. And what's really amusing is how everyone used a pseudonym, and nobody attached their own face to the recording. Vaporwave albums were presented as age-old artifacts, a promotional disc issued by some defunct East Asian corporation. The mystery was part of the fun, as you might stumble across one of these on YouTube at 3 a.m. and have no idea what you encounter. Though, by and large, I think everyone just found them on 4chan. Also, the fact that Vaporwave could be boiled down to a few key features, slowed down music, Japanese characters, those early 3D graphics, meant that thousands of poor imitations were soon flooding the market. When MTV rebranded in 2015, they took heavily from the Vaporwave aesthetic, marking a symbolic end to the movement. Suddenly, the corporations that Vaporwave aimed to satirize were reclaiming it for their own purposes. Fitting. So even though Vaporwave has crawled its way into the mainstream, now gracing t-shirts at your local mall, I think it deserves a place fairly deep on the iceberg. After all, it came deep from the underground. And I mean that literally, from people's basements. Number 8, Hyperpop. In 2013, a mysterious artist called Sophie uploaded a song to SoundCloud. Accompanied by a picture of a glossy 3D rendered water slide, the song featured a massive distorted bass line, squeaky high vocals, and nothing else.
So, I can make you feel better. If you let me, I can make you feel better.
The song's peculiar mix and ultra-twee pop vocals garnered it a polarizing reaction. An early comment on SoundCloud read, "This track is in the twilight halfway between awesome and annoying." Little did they know, but both this track and this comment would come to define the ethos of a new genre. If Vaporwave's goal was to explore the lost future promised by 80s technology, then Hyperpop did the same thing 1 decade later. Specifically, the ultra-twee, ultra-sexualized world of 90s Eurodance.
Barbie, let's go party. Come on, Barbie, let's go party.
As well as other genres that took pop conventions to an extreme, like chiptune and crunkcore. When Sophie's music became popular in the mid-2010s, it was often called PC music, after the label run by A.G. Cook, which Sophie was associated with. PC Music launched the careers of Hannah Diamond, Girlfriend of the Year, and many other artists who would solidify this movement as a distinct genre of music. Generally speaking, you'd hear big, distorted, or hyperactive beats combined with childlike vocals. Visually, hyperpop albums would have glossy digital artwork, or photos that presented each artist like a product. Borrowing from Vaporwave, Sophie would conceal her identity altogether, showing different 3D renderings of water slides for each of her releases. She would use a digitally altered voice in interviews.
There's an actual rumour that you're a grown man called Sam from Scotland. What's going on with your voice?
I've got a cough.
And hyper-feminized models to present the music live. All of this gave hyperpop a strong air of mystery and subversion. When several members of PC Music collaborated on the song Hey Cutie, they presented it as an ad for a fake energy drink, led by a mysterious frontwoman named Cutie. When Sophie's album Product was released in 2015, it was packaged along with a silicone toy. Let's just leave it at that. By taking the consumerism, infantilism, and hypersexuality of pop music and driving it up to the extreme, PC Music made a lot of people uncomfortable. A Vice article from the time shared some of Hey Cutie's most bitter YouTube comments. But it undeniably struck a chord with many listeners who found this surreal universe to be liberating, or just enjoyed the way it seemed to troll your average frat party dubstep fan.
Crazy in the pop, crazy in the pop, if that's what you wanna do.
In 2017, Sophie came out as transgender and revealed herself publicly for the first time. While hyperpop had always been popular among queer and trans music fans, this further expanded a new dimension for the genre. Many trans musicians realized the simulated world of hyperpop, with its pitched-up vocals and digital imagery, allowed them to create personas that could affirm their gender identity. Today, many trans hyperpop musicians carry the torch after Sophie's tragic death in 2021. Of course, subversive movements never last forever, and by the end of the decade, many felt that hyperpop was losing its critical awareness and simply becoming another way to produce pop music. Or ultra raunchy club anthems. Ironically, it wasn't until this point, around 2020, that hyperpop finally emerged as the official name for the genre, thanks to a Spotify playlist, which has expanded the definition of hyperpop quite a bit. So again, like Vaporwave, this is a genre that has crawled its way into the mainstream. Some of the biggest bands in the world right now fall under the hyperpop label, but still, I think it deserves a place fairly deep on the iceberg. During most of the 2010s, this music was hated. Okay guys, this is normally where I would read an ad, but we don't have a sponsor lined up for this video, so instead, I'm going to talk about ourselves. Bandsplaining consists of myself, our designer, Party Coletta, and our chief editor, Aldo. We're all musicians ourselves, and we recently started a podcast on the Bandsplaining Patreon, where we talk more fascinating music stories and share our favorite underground tracks. In fact, the latest upload is actually a follow-up to this video, where me and Aldo talk more about the new genres of the 2010s. As I said earlier, Patreon is also where we post uncensored versions of these videos, as well as other bonus content. So, once this is over, go check it out. Okay. Number 9, SoundCloud Rap. Every year since the late 2000s, the hip-hop magazine XXL has featured a freshman class, 10 to 12 up-and-coming rappers who are profiled and given a chance to freestyle in a filmed performance. The magazine was eerily accurate in identifying artists who would indeed blow up, and the release of each year's list and accompanying videos became a much-anticipated event for hip-hop fans. Well, in 2016, things went down a bit differently. In a video that has now become legendary, members of this year's class, including Lil Uzi Vert, 21 Savage, and Kodak Black, made a mockery of the whole event, sloppily improvising, often falling off beat,
Through the rain when I had no guard with no ice,
but at the same time cheering each other on, and all around having a blast.
Put up in a motherfucking Brinks truck.
This was Gen Z's breakout moment, and the dawn of a new sound in mainstream hip-hop, a sound that would be loosely defined as SoundCloud Rap. Now, I need to confess something. When this music emerged in the mid-2010s, it was the first time I just felt too old for a new genre. I missed it completely. But in the spirit of this video, I've spent the last few days catching up. So I want to ask for your leniency in the comments, but here we go. By the mid-2010s, cloud rap and drill music had thoroughly changed the hip-hop landscape. The palette of acceptable sounds and vocal styles had expanded. The importance of record labels and the music press had decreased. Instead, dozens of rappers were blowing up just from posting a demo or music video that went viral. For SoundCloud, it was the perfect storm of circumstances. iPods were out, but Spotify had yet to fully take over. MySpace was folding, and Facebook was never really meant for music. SoundCloud, on the other hand, was all of these things in one. In 2014, a group of rappers on the platform would start to develop modest followings. Their styles varied, although you heard a lot of atmosphere. A lot of trap beats, and a lot of the vocal style that would disparagingly be called mumble rap. The next couple years would be a slow burn, but by 2016, these artists would start to break out. Lil Uzi Vert, for example, would go from a modest 35,000 followers to nearly 1 million. It's also around this time you start to hear another trend. More and more rappers were posting songs inspired by grunge and emo, genres that traditionally couldn't be more opposite from hip-hop. While some artists would remain definitively within this niche, others would bounce around, posting ultra-aggressive beats one moment, and then a soft emo rap the next. More than ever before in hip-hop, lyrical themes of depression, mental illness, heartbreak, and existential angst were thrown totally out in the open, although the traditional themes of street violence, drug use, and materialism were also still there. This duality was thoroughly represented by XXXTentacion, whose deeply troubled life was played out publicly. While some of his songs were explosions of angst, he also released tracks that were practically emo folk. In fact, his whole album called 17 is incredibly varied and also incredibly haunting. X's career would unfortunately be cut short because in 2018, at only 20 years old, he was shot and murdered while out shopping in Florida. This is a trend that was unfortunately all too common in SoundCloud Rap, as Lil Peep and Juice WRLD also died tragically young from overdoses, both at age 21. And meanwhile, other rappers like Tekashi 6ix9ine had their careers interrupted by prison terms. I know there's a lot more that could be said about this genre, but given the circumstances, I'm gonna leave it at that. I thought this video by Brendan Spiegel did a great job of explaining the history. So if you want to learn more, I recommend checking that out. Now, where SoundCloud Rap fits on the iceberg is a little tricky, since we're talking about such a broad genre, where some artists topped the charts, and others remained totally underground. So I'm gonna try something creative and put SoundCloud Rap sideways. There we go. So at this point, we've covered all the main genres I wanted to get into. The ones that I personally think have had the biggest impact on the music and zeitgeist of the 2010s. But in the interest of fairness, and to try to reduce the number of angry comments we get, I'm gonna rapid fire mention a few more. Here we go. Witch House. So, Witch House is a genre I wasn't originally going to include, since it first broke out in the late 2000s. But I suppose since we're including Chillwave, I should at least mention it. Witch House was born out of the same hypnagogic pop movement as Chillwave or Vaporwave. But instead of using laid-back funk or Muzak as its source material, it used goth, occult, and horror-themed sounds. There also tends to be hip-hop beats inspired by chopped and screwed. Salem is usually credited as one of the pioneers, if not the pioneers of Witch House. On their first EP, you can hear the influence of shoegaze, with wispy vocals and a huge wall of sound. Oh, and we're gonna put Witch House right here. Amapiano. So, of all the genres on this list, Amapiano is probably the newest. I think it will most likely be remembered as a genre of the 2020s, but since it did originate in the mid to late 2010s, I think we should at least give it a shout out. Amapiano is from South Africa. Its rhythm comes from deep house music, but with a few distinct differences. It's slower, more laid back, and has that ever-present shaker. Secondly, there's the log drum.
It's a raw bass line with a heavy kick drum effect. When you hear it, you know you're listening to Amapiano.
And as my fellow YouTuber Servita Music points out, a hallmark of Amapiano is that this bass line can be totally unpredictable.
And what I love about these bass lines is it just straight up goes crazy. That's not an exaggeration. They just kind of do whatever they want.
Very much recommend that full video if you're into the specific drum beats of different genres. Now, if you feel like you've heard this type of bass line earlier in this video, that's because you did, and Davido's unavailable during our Afrobeats segment. Davido co-wrote this song with South African producer Musa Keys, and this is just one example of collaboration between Nigerian Afrobeats and South African Amapiano artists. In fact, the artist who currently holds the #1 spot on the Billboard Afrobeats chart is Tyla, a predominantly Amapiano artist from South Africa. Genres are totally distinct in their origins and main features. I think we'll continue to see a lot of blending. Also, despite the fact that Amapiano is now becoming mainstream, it was still pretty much a regional thing at the end of the 2010s. So we're gonna place it right here. Phonk. Phonk, spelled Phonk, refers to the revival of Memphis hip-hop that became a worldwide phenomenon during the 2010s. This specific misspelling of funk originated from rapper and producer Space Ghost Perp, who, as we mentioned earlier, was a pioneer of cloud rap. Well, he also brought about a renewed interest in the dark, satanic, coding-laced world of Memphis hip-hop. We actually have a whole segment on funk in this video, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. But what's especially interesting is that by the end of the 2010s, a variant of this genre featuring pitched-up cowbells had become hugely popular in Eastern Europe and Brazil. If you watch TikTok or Instagram Reels, there's a good chance you've heard some of these tunes. So even though funk has pretty dark and disturbing origins, we aren't quite at the bottom of the iceberg yet. Funk Mandelão. So this genre comes from Brazil and goes by a few different names. Funk Mandelão or Funk Automotivo. It's rooted in Brazilian funk, the dance hip-hop genre that's been popular for decades. However, Funk Mandelão takes things in a different direction. It features minimal, repetitive vocals over a severely distorted bass that imitates the sound of car subwoofers, verging on the point of destruction. The minimal mix, at times featuring nothing more than vocals, can be surprisingly aggressive. The name Mandelão refers to the neighborhood this music originates from in Rio de Janeiro, where it was played at block parties, though other sources say it came from Praia Grande outside Sao Paulo. Regardless, thanks to viral popularity on the internet, it's now heard across the country, and even in places like Ukraine and Kazakhstan. There's this weird Brazil post-Soviet connection that's been going on lately. Someone should investigate that. While for Brazilians, this genre would probably be higher on the list, I just find this to be such a wild and unique sound. I'm putting it pretty low on the iceberg. Egg punk. In 2017, an Instagram account that specialized in punk memes posted this image. It was comparing the leather and chain imagery of traditional hardcore bands with the goofy, clownish imagery of newer bands. In particular, there was a fried egg. This set off a series of memes and discussions that began to define one set of bands as chain punk, the ones who stayed true to hardcore's roots. And the other as egg punk, the ones with a more satirical, new wave inspired sound. The egg punk sound is usually credited to the Coneheads from Northwest Indiana. It is disjointed, lo-fi, and owes a lot to Devo. When synths are used, they're cheesy and fun. It's hauntological in the sense that it recreates 80s recording gear and Xeroxed art. But by and large, it doesn't take itself too seriously. I would have placed egg punk deeper on the iceberg, but the fact that John Mayer has posted about it raises it a few inches. There we go. HexD. Like Amapiano, HexD is one of the newer genres on this list. One that just barely manages to qualify as a genre of the 2010s. And one that isn't well documented at all. I had to borrow most of what I'm going to say from Reddit posts, so grain of salt. The term HexD originally referred not to the genre, but a style of editing. When you take a song, whether it's one you created or one you sampled, then absolutely blow it out with BitCrusher, you are hexing the song. According to Rate Your Music, this process originated from SoundCloud rappers who wanted to create a particularly dark and distorted atmosphere. Since then, it's been applied to trance and breakbeats, which are typically sped up, evoking the most intense moment in an RPG boss battle. You can also see this as an evolution of Vaporwave for Gen Zers, as HexD imagery often evokes nostalgia for the mid-2000s, like this Game Boy Advance cover, this Subaru Impreza, or this Pokemon that's not in the original 151. As a solid millennial, this makes HexD weird and scary to me. So I'm going to give it the lowest position on the iceberg. In my defense, it definitely has the least mainstream coverage of any of these. Jizz Jazz. Alright, so this is not a real genre term. Nobody uses it, but I've been looking for something to describe that fusion of indie rock with loungy funk music that became super common in the 2010s. And there was nothing else for it. I looked everywhere. Jizz Jazz is an awful term created by Mac DeMarco, but look, just bear with me. So after reading about hauntology and how Vaporwave and Hyperpop created nostalgia for these lost futures, I've come to realize how Mac DeMarco very much did the same thing when he first hit the scene in 2012. The whole idea of a rock and roll nightclub is a concept from the past, and the way he sings in a deep seductive voice, lyrics like Boogie Woogie Woman, evokes a swagger and confidence that is very much not from his generation.
Gangsters, what's up guys?
Future Mac DeMarco releases would often feature this slow funk rhythm with an ultra syncopated bass line. You can hear it in so many songs. Now, personally, I was playing a lot of shows in basements and indie venues throughout the 2010s, and starting around 2015, a lot of bands started copying this. I think I'd argue that Mac DeMarco finally dethroned The Strokes as the default influence for indie bands. But it was happening with pretty major bands too. Tame Impala, Mild High Club, Men I Trust, just to name a few. Now, again, I've done a few searches and never found a term for or even a discussion about this trend. Maybe it's all in my head. But Jizz Jazz is the term Mac DeMarco once used to describe his music, so that's the one I'm gonna put up on the board. Pretty high up. And for the record, my band never did fall to the pressure of adopting this loungy, easy listening sound. Though maybe we'd be more successful if we did. City Pop Revival and Future Funk. Okay, so this one I actually want to spend a second on. Another massive global music trend that started in the 2010s is the revival of a certain easy-listening pop genre that originally came from Japan. City Pop itself was an appropriation of American soul, disco, and funk music, but seen through the eyes of 1980s Japan. At this time, the country was at the height of its economic miracle. Cities were booming, technologically advanced and affluent. City Pop reflected the optimism in the air, with its carefree mood, upbeat energy, and lyrics about romance and nightlife.
Stay with me.
Of course, Japan's economic bubble would infamously pop in the early 90s, and the drastic change in national mood, along with the emergence of newer pop and dance genres, made City Pop a relic of the past. For years, it languished in the bargain bin, desired only by the odd record collector, remaining virtually unknown outside Japan. That is, of course, until the great sample boom of the 2010s. In the era of cloud rap and vaporwave, when musicians were searching for samples that evoked a certain haunting nostalgia, city pop proved to be a gold mine. As far as I'm aware, Lil B was the first one to use a city pop sample in this context, when he borrowed from Yukiko Okada on his 2011 track, The Wilderness.
Had no friends, I was looking for an angel. Wanted the floor map, but I ain't had no angles.
Shortly after, Vaporwave artists like Yunbei, Macros 82 to 99, and Night Tempo would base entire albums off sampling and remixing city pop classics. For example, on Yunbei's track, Bay City Rollas, he borrows from Junko Yagami. However, the song is sped up, beefier drums are added, and Junko's vocals are spliced and looped, resulting in a chaotic, high-energy remix. This new offshoot of Vaporwave was later dubbed Future Phonk, and although it remains a fairly niche internet genre, it spurred a wave of interest in city pop overall. Albums from the 80s were uploaded to YouTube, available to a Western audience for the first time, and suddenly the algorithm started recommending them. Tracks like Plastic Love amassed tens of millions of views. Interesting about the sudden city pop revival is that it was seemingly happening everywhere. If you look at those future funk producers I mentioned, they're from Portland, Mexico City, Seoul, and New York. Bands that play a combination of city pop and indie rock have become popular in China, Taiwan, and LA. Not to mention back in Japan, where a cover of Plastic Love by Friday Night Plans blew up in 2020. So for this revival of city pop, I'm going to put it fairly close to the top. Just about everyone on the internet knew about it, except for one clueless YouTuber.
There's another genre called city pop. Do you know?
I'm not familiar. Future Phonk I'll put slightly lower since, you know, it was doing interesting things. Alright, so it is at long last I give you the full iceberg of 2010's genres. Well, just about. I know there's some I'm still missing, so again, just leave a comment, share a link to your favorite song, and that way others can see it. Now, two things that surprised me. For one, I wasn't expecting to see Chillwave come up nearly as much as it did. It's cited as a main influence for alternative R&B, cloud rap, vaporwave, hyperpop, future funk, to some extent even Neoperreo, and definitely that Mac DeMarco genre. I don't think it's because all these different artists and all these different genres just loved Washed Out. No offense to them. Rather, I think it's because Chillwave was, as Noisy puts it, the first great genre of the internet era. It had the humor and sensibility of message boards. Its eclectic use of samples and purposefully lo-fi mixes could probably be linked to the early days of browsing YouTube, stumbling across an old episode of The X-Files in 240p. It was the first mainstream genre to make us obsessed with nostalgia and the lost futures we supposedly dream about. And this was the second thing that surprised me, the whole concept of hauntology. I've always wondered why the people of my generation have become so overtaken by nostalgia, to the point where telling a friend at a party, "Hey, you look like you're from the 80s, is actually a great compliment. In his writings, Mark Fisher warns about the slow cancellation of new genres, as corporations and consumers alike decide not to take on the risks of unproven concepts, instead repackaging old music, films, and ideas over and over again. He specifically points out how Adele and the Arctic Monkeys two artists popular in the UK at the time of his essay, would fit in just as well in the 90s as they did in the 2000s. A sign that no radical cultural changes had happened in between. While this certainly describes some of the music of the 2010s, I think there's still a lot of music that would have been surprising 10 years earlier. Imagine how Lil B's I'm God would have been received in 2001.
Somebody tell the trees I'm here now.
Or Sophie's Hard in 2004. Even if you went back in time and showed Lisa Frank 420 to Diana Ross, I think she'd find the chopped and screwed sampling to be pretty bewildering. And this is not to mention a whole genre like Afrobeats, which isn't dealing in nostalgia whatsoever. It's just cool, futuristic music. Okay guys, I'm gonna wrap it there. Thanks for watching, and remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment, you know the drill. Get on down there, join the debate. Alright, until next time.